Not all Vietnamese have a nostalgia for the Vietnamese countryside. Strangely, a corner of the Vietnamese vegetable garden in the middle of North Texas is always recognized by any Vietnamese and always wins the hearts of anyone. Is it possible that deep down in the subconscious, every Vietnamese immigrant still has traces of Vietnamese rural culture? A trace that is almost completely lost in the second generation of migrants. See you, old friend. Ask where these days I said in Dallas. You open the map and don't know where it is. The big city located in the southwest middle of the United States border, on the map with your lone star. It is not symbolized even by a dot. You ask again, what do? I say gardening. You sigh. What do you think? You want to go to the US, but if you garden you don't need to be exiled. Just laugh. The control of agricultural products at the border gates into the US soil is quite thorough, but Vietnamese vegetables are still almost fully present in Vietnamese markets and in Vietnamese gardens. In Mr. David Nguyen garden there are broccoli, melon cabbage, melon, spinach, mint vegetables. He guarantees that mint leaves treat cough extremely well. Mr. Min Ho garden has gourd, dangerous peppers. Mr. Duc Nguyen house has chives, celery, lettuce, basil, lemon balm, perilla. I tried to grow water spinach, amaranth, spinach, not very successful. The short time from when it was warm enough for them to germinate until it was too cold, causing them to stop growing enough for them to grow. Only one gang tay. My first gardening season completely failed when I was about planting seeds brought from Vietnam. In the second season, I learned some secrets of other Vietnamese people. Cinnamon vegetables to buy at the Vietnamese market in the spring. Cut off the leaves to eat and put the stalks in a glass of water to put on the table for a week. The cinnamon stalks began to grow roots. Wait a few more days for the roots to grow a little longer and then plant them in pots by the window. During the day, the sun is warm, bring them out. At night it is cold, they will be planted indoors. In the summer, planted in the garden. It sounds extreme, but the vegetables I grow are fresh and fragrant. Served with a piece of beef in a bowl of pho is really out of mind, but American cinnamon vegetables have a completely different smell, not eaten properly at all. In autumn, it is cold, the tree dies. But if you can spread the seeds on the ground, the next spring the seeds will germinate by themselves and grow new trees. So are the perilla and broccoli, lemon basil, chives and lettuce are climate adaptable. In the 4 seasons in winter the trees fade, but the roots still try to ambush in the ground, waiting for the end of the warm spring to grow and spread. Gardening, planting a few Vietnamese plants hips just to have a little familiar taste in the family meal. But also an act of expressing nostalgia for the homeland, an attempt to create a living environment close to their original culture, especially for those who used to live in the countryside of Vietnam before wandering to the US. A loofah often does not have time to give fruit before the cold autumn suddenly begins. But the shape of the loofah trellis behind the house is reminiscent of deer making that corner of the garden, a corner of the hometown, a place of return of the soul after the struggles. Dallas summer is very hot, but in the afternoon when going home from work, lying in the hammock under the loofah trellis, beats a short sleep, and then waking up to eat a meal with a dangerous chili with fish sauce is a small consolation in exiled life. Besides, gardening in Dallas is a great pleasure. For those years of spring and summer, here are very long days, sometimes too hot, sometimes rainy, favorable for vegetables to grow. I can grow cucumbers, beans, squash, lettuce, greens, broccoli, onions, chives, garlic, peppers, tomatoes, herbs, celery, cilantro, dill, lettuce, cinnamon, basil, mint. Only the bulbs are not very successful, pointing to the leaves, not the bulbs. The vegetable garden is a cultural bridge connecting me with the world I live in, not only with the soil, plants, and the surrounding natural environment, but also with my neighbors and other Vietnamese people when exchanging experience in growing crops or seedlings. A curious question from a German-American neighbor about perilla. What plant is it? Leading to the story of a refreshing porridge, a roll, a newly opened Vietnamese restaurant in Arlington nearby Jerry Jones' world that she had just come to enjoy the spring meal, then spread to other cultural issues. Thereby, I experienced that people of different races understand each other's culture more easily thanks to the taste and color of specific cabbage stalks, but based on vague concepts in geography books and prejudices from television or Hollywood movies. And for compatriots, the vegetable garden is a gentle meeting point of different political people of different ages and backgrounds. A marigold tree blooms among the innocent broccoli, reminiscent of the color of a country new year, especially when Dallas early autumn is cold, just like a day at the end of December in the Northeast in my hometown. Not all Vietnamese people have a nostalgia for the Vietnamese countryside. Many people grew up in urban areas and before coming to the US only knew the street corners and alleys in Saigon. Not everyone is interested in gardening, or has a hand of gardening, and many people do not have time to garden. But strangely, a corner of the Vietnamese vegetable garden in the middle of Dallas, Texas, is always recognized by any Vietnamese and always wins the hearts of anyone. Is it possible that deep down in the subconscious every Vietnamese immigrant still has traces of Vietnamese rural culture? A trace that is almost completely lost in the second generation of immigrants. But there is another aspect of gardening that when I talk to Vietnamese people in Dallas I realize that the gardener, even though he is an actor, has a more specific ability to integrate and be more attached to where he lives, whether consciously or not, whether he makes efforts or not. First of all, the weather. The rain here is not like the rain and sun here. Gardening for a few years knows the weather rhythm where you live, even though the Ellingham weather is very erratic. People here may watch the weather test every day and forecast the weather, but when the weather forecast not only makes people think simply today it is sunny or cold, but makes people calculate when to plant plants. Wondering about the early frost to cover the vegetables fragrant or celebrating a warm wave of sunshine will make the chili plant bear fruit. Then along with the attention to the sun, rain, wind, storm, soil, water, insects, weeds. People gradually adapt, get used to, and stick to the land they are living in a more realistic and emotional way, through the garden land behind the house. Where people garden for a while will naturally adapt to the weather. There I noticed, through the daily conversation, the person who commented that the weather here is good is a person who has a gardener and often has no intention of moving to another state. The person who complains that living here is boring, wants to go somewhere else, has a superficial understanding of the weather, and often does not bother with the garden. One thing that cannot be denied is that if Vietnamese people say that if the land is flax, then the bird will land, that is also the reason Elon Musk said SpaceX headquarters will relocate to Texas from California. It is very common that people are used to the climate of that country for a while, and the sun, rain, and snow of that country more or less make an imprint on every person living long in that climate. Climate certainly has an impact on people's way of life and thinking. Changes in cultural life are complex in terms of impact factors, how they progress, and consequences. The effects of climate change are a factor that has never been little noticed, but I think is a significant factor. The second thing that makes me consider gardening as an expression of integration of immigrants is to take care of the garden that makes people stick to the land, whether the person is from the countryside or is a farmer or not. Some people who come to winter, the garden is covered with snow, just hope to return to Vietnam to celebrate Tet. But in March and April, they restlessly remember the vegetable garden behind the house in Dallas, worried that the new sprouts of young trees will be eaten by slugs, afraid that the abnormal frost will freeze the apple blossoms, cherry blossoms make them not bear fruit. It sounds like that small garden calls me back. Feels like the plants I planted there are orphaned without my care. Where people have planted a tree, it is no longer a completely unfamiliar place. The bond between people and the land can be through many ways, but by cultivating that land, this attachment is primitive, instinctive. Since the time when human ancestors stopped wandering, farming, and possessing land, a manifestation of the sense of settlement and community building. Except for a few who live in rented houses or mobile assembly houses, usually newcomers, the vast majority of Vietnamese people in North Texas buy houses. Most of them are pre-built houses, but few people are able to build houses according to their own design, and often set aside a piece of land around the house for vegetable gardening. A loofah or Vietnamese vegetable garden behind an American house is a way to confirm that this land belongs to me or vice versa, I belong to this land. Fortunately, I had the opportunity to visit many Vietnamese people from many different social sectors living in different regions of the US. I saw someone expand the living room to plant bananas, scowl in the tub, build a lake to release duckweed, raise Leathea fish, almost set up a tropical garden in a glass cage house. Someone bought all the handmade rattan interior decorations from Vietnam. Someone stayed in the house with all modern American-style amenities, only for out a corner of the garden covering a watery coconut leaf roof above a crockery pot with a coconut shell. Each person in different ways incarnates the original cultural imprint on the adaptation of the new homeland habitat as an expression of the original personal character and cultural identity. That personality and identity is harmonious, unique, or scary, messy is another issue which will be discussed later. Happy garden, thank you God, bless America.